Bloody Murder: The Death of Abby and Andrew Borden in 1892.
Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks, and when she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Schoolyard rhyme.
The trial of Lizzie Borden for the murder of her father and stepmother was widely covered by newspapers of the day. The case's notoriety sparked a schoolyard rhyme, countless books and plays. Although Borden was acquitted, she never escaped the stigma of the accusations against her. Abby and Andrew Borden sat down for breakfast on the hot morning of August 4, 1892, with their guest John Morse. Andrew, 70, was one of the wealthiest men in Fall River, Massachusetts. He had been involved in the furniture business for 33 years and had accumulated a lot of real estate, including 2 farms in Swansea. His assets were worth an estimated $350,000. He was also president of the Union Savings Bank. He lived in a plain, unpretentious, 1.5-story house at 92 2nd Street with his second wife, Abby, 64, and 2 unmarried daughters from his first marriage, Emma, 41, and Lizzie, 32. Morse, 59, was Lizzie and Emma's maternal uncle. He had arrived for a visit the day before from New Bedford and stayed overnight. It was the same day that Andrew and Lizzie had been violently ill. The trio wondered if there was poison in the bread they ate or the milk they drank. Lizzie had stayed in her room all morning prior to Morse's arrival. A day later, the family was feeling well again. After Abby, Andrew, and Morse had finished breakfast that August morning, housemaid Bridget Sullivan, 25, washed the breakfast dishes while Abby dusted. Morse and Andrew Borden went to the sitting room to relax. They read the newspapers and chatted until about 8:45 a.m., then Morse prepared to leave so that he could run errands. Andrew left the house soon afterwards for business appointments at the Union Savings Bank. He then went to see Jonathan Clegg, a furniture dealer who wanted to lease a store from him. Meanwhile, inside the Borden household, Lizzie came downstairs and decided to have coffee and cookies for breakfast. Abby told Sullivan to wash the windows on the ground floor. Then she went upstairs to the guest room to make the bed. The housemaid began washing the outside of the 3 parlor windows at the front of the house. There were also 2 in the dining room and 2 in the sitting room. One door was unlocked, but she didn't see anyone enter or leave the house as she performed her task. She also did not hear Lizzie or Abby moving about inside the house. Sullivan was washing windows from the inside of the house when she heard a key turn in the front door at about 10:40 a.m. She opened the door and let Andrew inside. He had returned home with a parcel in his hand. He took off his coat and sat in a chair in the dining room. Lizzie came downstairs about 5 minutes later and asked her father if he had any mail. She told him that Abby had received a note and had gone out to visit a friend. Andrew then took the key to his bedroom from the mantel and walked up the back stairs to get a sweater. He came back down soon after and sat down in a rocking chair in the sitting room. Then he stretched out on the couch. As Sullivan washed the dining room windows, Lizzie took a small ironing board from the kitchen, laid it on the dining room table, and began to iron her handkerchiefs. After Sullivan had finished washing the windows, she went upstairs to her bedroom in the attic just before 11 a.m. She heard the City Hall clock strike 11 as she lay on her bed for a short nap. 10 minutes later, Lizzie yelled, "Bridget, come down quick. Father's dead. Somebody's come in and killed him." Sullivan rushed downstairs to the sitting room on the first floor. When she entered the room, she saw Andrew Borden lying sprawled on the couch. He had been struck 7 times and had deep axe wounds on his face and head. Lizzie told Sullivan to run out and fetch family physician Dr. Seabury Bowen at his home. The housemaid crossed 2nd Street, but the doctor was not at his house. Lizzie then sent her out again to summon Alice Russell, a family friend who lived several blocks away. Just at that time, neighbor Adelaide Churchill returned home from grocery shopping. She looked out of her kitchen window and saw Lizzie leaning against her own door looking agitated. Lizzie announced that someone had killed Mr. Borden. She asked Mrs. Churchill to come over. While Churchill was crossing the street, she spotted newsdealer John Cunningham in front of a house 4 doors down from the Bordens. She told him that she wanted a policeman. He phoned the city marshal and told him that there had been a stabbing or a fight at the Borden residence. Russell were in the kitchen consoling Lizzie. Sullivan arrived home and asked where Abby was. Lizzie told her to go upstairs to check because a nervous Sullivan refused to go by herself. Churchill accompanied her. When Sullivan had nearly reached the upper floor, she peered into the guest room. The bedroom door was wide open and Abby Borden's body was lying on the floor. Sullivan ran into the room and stood at the foot of the bed. Abby was lying face down between the bed and the dresser, her arms folded across her chest and pinned beneath her body. It was 11:30 a.m., and the last time Sullivan had seen her was at 9 a.m. Churchill and the housemaid walked back downstairs and a sickened Sullivan ran outside to the yard to vomit. Dr. Bowen, who had made his way to the family's home, examined the bodies of Andrew and Abby. Blood was still dripping from Andrew's wounds, but Abby was lying in a pool of thick, dark, and dry congealed blood. The Brussels carpet's canvas backing kept the blood at the top of the carpet when it dried instead of letting it seep through to the bottom. Abby had been attacked from behind and sustained more than a dozen struggled against their attacker. It appeared that both had died instantly. Police investigation. Policemen began arriving at the house shortly after both bodies were discovered. The first officer to arrive on the scene 10 minutes earlier. He had raced back to the station to tell City Marshal Rufus Hilliard that there had been a murder. Deputy Sheriff Francis H. Wixon was in the marshal's office when he heard the news. Investigators asked Lizzie where she was when the slayings occurred. She explained that she woke up late, went downstairs, and spoke to her father when he returned home. She assumed that her stepmother had gone out to see a friend. Then she went to the barn behind the house for 20 minutes to find a lead sinker for fishing. She returned after hearing a cry coming from the house. She entered the sitting room and saw her father on the sofa, bloody and lifeless. Robbery was not the motive for the attack since Andrew's watch and money remained. Police believed that someone who stood to benefit from their deaths had killed the couple. When Lizzie was questioned after the murders, she said that her father had quarreled with a man called Clegg about renting a shop for activities of which the prohibitionist Andrew did not approve. Photos were taken of the bodies and the Borden property. Fall River medical examiner Dr. William Dolan arrived and laid the bodies of the victims on the dining room table. He examined their heads and removed the stomachs for further investigation. They were sent to Professor E. S. Wood of Harvard Medical School for analysis, along with milk that the family had consumed just before becoming ill the day before. Dolan knew that the Bordens had died of their head injuries. But he wanted to rule out the possibility that someone had attempted to poison them before the fatal blows were administered. He also wanted to determine the time of death, based on the degree to which the food they ate at breakfast had been digested. The information would tell him who was killed first and the amount of time that had elapsed between the two killings. The police continued questioning Lizzie. They asked her if there were any axes in the house. She had Sullivan take the officers down to the cellar. They found 4 axes in a box near the furnace. One hatchet had the handle broken off and the blade was covered with ash. Police thought the handle had been snapped off and the remaining head was the murder weapon. Sullivan also took the police through the house as they searched it, locking doors as she went. The previous summer someone had entered the house in broad daylight, stole a watch and other valuables, and escaped without being seen. Emma, Lizzie, and Sullivan were home at the time. The barn was broken into less than a year later. Every door to the house was kept locked after the first break-in. Police saw no signs of an intruder, and they were puzzled by the absence of blood around the bodies. About 20 minutes after the bodies were found, John Morse returned to the Borden home for lunch, unaware of the events that had unfolded in his absence. He walked to the backyard to pick some pears and ate part of one. Sullivan was standing at the back door when he entered the house. She told him that Mr. and Mrs. Borden had been murdered. Morse opened the sitting room door and saw doctors and the police inside. He walked in and glanced at Andrew's body, and then he went upstairs to see Abby's in the very guest room in which he had slept the night before. Word of the double murder spreads. The day after the double slaying, the Borden family offered a $5,000 Reward to anyone who helped find the murderers and secure a conviction. In the meantime, police searched for but did not find a note from a sick friend asking Abby to visit. Lizzie said that Mrs. Borden tore it up after reading it and burned it. Bits of charred paper were found in the stove, but police couldn't determine if it was that note. Then came what police believed was a break in the case. At D.R. Smith's drugstore, clerk Eli Benz said that Lizzie had been in the store within 36 hours before the double slaying and had asked to purchase prussic acid, but he refused to sell it to her without a prescription. He didn't know her by name, but he positively identified her when police officers brought him to the Borden house and he saw her there. Lizzie denied that she had been to the drugstore, but investigators were suspicious. On Sunday, August 7th, Alice Russell watched as her friend Lizzie burned a dress in the kitchen stove. "I am going to burn the old thing up. It's all covered with paint," she explained. Arrest of Lizzie Borden. Lizzie was arrested 4 days later, after an inquest before Judge Josiah Blaisdell wrapped up in the courtroom above the Central Police Station. Just after 7 p.m. on August 11, 1892, her lawyer Andrew Jennings was brought to the matron's room, where Lizzie was lying on the sofa after spending the afternoon at the inquest. She was charged with murder. In the suffocating heat the next day, Lizzie was arraigned in 2nd District Court before Judge J.C. Blaisdell. In a weak voice, she stood up and pleaded not guilty. Why? She was not granted bail. She left the courtroom leaning heavily on Reverend E.I. Buck, the city missionary. At 3 p.m. she was brought from the Central Police Station to the train, and then she was sent to Bristol County Jail in Taunton that afternoon by City Marshal Rufus H. Hilliard. More crowds gathered to watch. Preliminary hearing. Lizzie was held behind bars until her preliminary hearing began on August 22, 1892. She did not testify, but family lawyer Andrew Jennings entered her testimony from the inquest into evidence. Harvard Medical School chemist Professor Wood analyzed the stomach contents of the 2 victims. He testified that based on the degree of digestion, Abby Borden died at about 9:30 a.m., more than an hour before her husband was stabbed to death between 10:55 and 11:10 a.m. Wood checked the stomach contents for signs of prussic acid but found none. Wood also studied the hatchets and axes found in the family's cellar. He concluded that none were the murder weapon. He examined Lizzie's clothes. The white skirt had one spot, which looked like blood, that was directly in the front about 6 inches from the bottom. However, there was no blood on her shoes or stockings. Wood testified that given the nature of the attack on Andrew and Abby Borden, it wasn't possible for the assailant to escape without getting any blood on himself or herself. At the hearing it was revealed that there was tension in the Borden household. Mrs. Borden and her stepdaughters were not on good terms. When the preliminary hearing ended on September 1, 1892, Justice Blaisdell, an old friend of Andrew Borden's, wiped away a tear as he said that he believed Lizzie might be guilty of the double murders. She was at odds with her stepmother and had had an opportunity to commit the slaying. Her attempt to buy poison showed premeditation. The grand jury met in November 1892 to consider 2 indictments. After deliberating for 6 days, they adjourned on November 21 without reaching a verdict. Then Alice Russell became convinced that Lizzie was guilty of killing her father and stepmother. District Attorney Hosea Knowlton recalled the jury, and Russell testified about seeing her friend burn a dress on Sunday, August 7, 3 days after the murders. Lizzie was indicted for both murders on December 2. Trial of Lizzie Borden. Although 10 months elapsed between the murders and the start of Lizzie Borden's trial in New Bedford on June 5, 1893, interest in the case had not abated. At least 50 reporters from New Bedford, Fall River, Providence, Boston, and New York covered the trial. A headquarters location for the press was set up in an old carriage shed behind the courtroom, and it was equipped with telegraph equipment and typewriters. Private wires were set up directly from the shed to the newsrooms of newspapers in New York, Boston, and Providence and the headquarters of the Associated Press. The trial began at 11:28 a.m. on June 5, 1893, before Chief Justice Albert Mason of the Superior Court, Judge Dewey, and Judge Blodgett. The High Sheriff of Bristol County, Andrew Wright, served as bailiff and called the court to order. prosecutors Hosea Knowlton and William Moody faced off against defense lawyers Andrew J. Jennings, Colonel Melvin O. Adams of Boston, and ex-Governor George D. Robinson. The following day, members of the public filled up the seats in the courtroom, while others stood outside the brick building. It was stiflingly hot. The prosecution began presenting its case. In his opening statement, Moody claimed that Lizzie had planned the murder in advance, and her contradictory statements given at the inquest proved that she was guilty. The prosecution believed that she was the only one with the opportunity and the motive to commit the murders. There was bad blood between Abby and her stepdaughters because they thought the property should be divided more evenly. Lizzie fainted for several minutes when Moody casually opened an ordinary-looking bag and removed the skulls of the two victims. She dropped her head and slid sideways in her chair, slumped over. Russell testified that Lizzie told her the night before the murder that she felt as though something terrible was about to happen and that she had seen a strange man loitering outside the house. Russell also testified about seeing Lizzie burn a dress on August 7. Housemaid Bridget Sullivan, who had worked for the family for nearly 3 years, said that there was no bad blood between Lizzie and Abby. Emma, the sister of the accused, testified that Lizzie had no reason to kill her father or stepmother. At the trial, the police admitted that they didn't carefully search the rooms, including Lizzie's, to see what dresses she had or if any showed signs of blood from the murder. Assistant Marshal John Fleet said that they searched the closet, attic, and rooms but did not open a trunk. Lizzie's lawyers argued in favor of not admitting the testimony she had given at the inquest because they said it had not been given voluntarily. Although she had not been placed under arrest at the time, she was under police surveillance within days of the murders. After both sides presented their arguments, the 3 judges retired. They returned just over an hour later and ruled that Lizzie had been a prisoner at the time of the inquest, and therefore, her testimony would not be admitted at the trial. The defense argued that Lizzie would only have had 8 to 13 minutes to change her dress or put another one on over it, broken the handle of the hatchet that was used in the murders, rubbed the blade with ash to conceal the blood, and clean herself up. The prosecution had no murder weapon and they lacked any forensic evidence tying Lizzie Borden to the murders. Their case was entirely circumstantial. Closing arguments were delivered 2 weeks after the trial began. Following about an hour and a half of deliberations, the foreman of the jury announced that they found Lizzie not guilty. The courtroom exploded with loud cheers. The double murder remains officially unsolved, but Lizzie Borden would never escape the stigma of the murder charges against her. Lizzie died on June 1, 1927, after a long illness. In the aftermath of her death, more than a dozen authors wrote books speculating about whether Lizzie Borden committed the murders and, if so, why. The story also sparked plays, an opera, and a ballet. The debate about Borden's guilt continues, but the facts are just as uncertain now as they were then. The case is no closer to being solved. If you like the video, please don't forget subscribe my channels. Thanks.